From this time forward, Buckingham Palace has been the official London residence of every British sovereign. When we look at the areas of London which John Nash created and the areas of Bath which John Wood created, the style of building is influenced by classical form. This type of architecture is predominantly featured in the novels of Jane Austen. The classicism we see displayed in Jane Austen's writing flourished between 1750 and 1830, and it is the period of architecture most appropriate to her own life. Architecture in this category is often referred to as neoclassical, purely to distinguish it from the classicism of ancient Greece and Rome, which of course are the source of its origins. To put this into context, we need to look at the styles which had preceded the fine Palladian building of Jane's day. Sir Christopher Wren typifies the English Baroque, which dominated the 17th century and still took its inspiration from Rome. St. Paul's Cathedral is a prime example, as are Blenheim Palace and Castle Howard, both the work of Sir John Vanbrugh, and both, we suspect, visited by Jane Austen. The 18th century saw the birth of a new style, Rococo, which rejected the massive, heavy relief of the Baroque in favour of a lighter and more elegant manner of building and decoration. Rome was no longer the major architectural influence, as Paris had become the artistic centre of Europe, and some of the best examples of the Rococo style can be seen in the chateaux and churches of France. The elegance which had begun with Rococo continued, and the fashionable young men who took the grand tour through Europe could count young architects among their number. Robert Adam was perhaps the most influential, translating the Roman remains he had witnessed in Italy into a new age of British architecture. Although the John Woods are the most famous architects of Bath, Robert Adam has left his mark here too. He designed and built the Pulteney Bridge, completing the project in 1774. Adam also had grand plans for a new Bathwick estate joined to the main city by his bridge. His neoclassical dreams were halted by the outbreak of war with America in 1775. Speculative building was hit hard, and when work on the Bathwick estate resumed in the late 1780s, it was Thomas Baldwin who took the project over. The French Revolution stopped Baldwin in his tracks, with its financial implications bankrupting many speculative builders. Thomas Baldwin was unfortunately one of them. While Bath was revelling in the elegance of neoclassicism, a new style of architecture was developing. The Gothic revival, which looked to medieval times for inspiration, started to become popular in the mid-1750s. There was an interesting overlap in styles at this time, with Sir John Vanbrugh, the great Baroque architect, being one of the first to build a house with a castle air. Robert Adam is also known to have been employed at Strawberry Hill, the great Gothic fantasy of Hugh Walpole. Jane Austen uses the Gothic imagery very effectively in her novel Northanger Abbey. Jane would have seen many houses embellished with battlements and turrets, as well as the building of folly castles and mock ruins to enhance a landscape. It is a folly castle that Jane uses in Northanger Abbey to set her readers a clue as to the true nature of one of her characters. John Thorpe has designs upon the heroine of the novel, Catherine Morland, and he invites her to visit Blaise Castle. Blaise Castle, as Jane Austen would have known, was built in 1766, and this is an example of Jane's playful style, teasing her readers. What she's doing is warning her reader of John Thorpe's phony character, his charm no more than a facade, making him in reality less than he pretends to be, just like Blaise Castle. "Blaise Castle?" cried Catherine. "What is that?" "The finest place in England, worth going 50 miles at any time to see." "What, is it really a castle, an old castle?" "The oldest in the kingdom." No look at the architecture of Jane Austen's day would be complete without considering the Royal Pavilion at Brighton. This was a simple farmhouse when the Prince of Wales bought it in 1786 for his secret bride, Mrs. Fitzherbert. Under the Prince's direction, it was firstly renovated as a neoclassical villa by architect Henry Holland. Then William Porden furnished it in Oriental style, also adding an Indian-style dome. It was John Nash of Buckingham Palace fame who was finally called upon to incorporate the dome into the rest of the building. This he did in a bizarre fashion, adding the famous onion-shaped domes and mini pagodas, mixing influences of the East with French style. The whole process took 35 years, and the Prince Regent and his friends turned the little seaside resort of Brighthelmstone into the fashionable seaside town of Brighton. The pavilion certainly added to the debts of the Prince Regent, and many of his friends, who he had encouraged to put money into the project, faced financial ruin. For the royal set, keeping up with the prince was an expensive business. The most famous man of fashion at the time, Beau Brummel, also suffered financial ruin, despite being a close friend of the prince. This cartoon by Gilray comments on how over-the-top fashion had become. Also, he implies that manners and style hide the true nature of mankind. The society which the prince and his entourage brought to Brighton would have appeared as polite and civilised, but at a distance from the eyes of authority in London, behaviour would have been pretty wild. Gambling was rife, and many people lost huge fortunes at the gaming tables. This was true for both men and women. Chatsworth House, the seat of the Devonshires, was rumoured to have been at risk because of the gambling habits of the 5th Duchess Georgiana. Gambling was not the only vice, and we only have to consider the Prince Regent's list of mistresses to appreciate this. Apart from the financial and moral consequences of the dual standards of society, another unpleasant phenomena was developing. The Regency fop. When Beau Nash set out his rules for civilised behaviour, great progress was made. Bath became a safe and tasteful place to be, where refined visitors went for amusement. By the time that Beau Brummel had reached the dizzy heights of fashion, Beau Nash's ideals had been taken to ridiculous extremes, resulting in effete young men, so caught up with manners, fashion and social niceties that they lacked any moral or intellectual substance whatsoever. Their tastes were expensive, and they preyed on heiresses to fund their habits. Jane Austen was well aware of them, and the character of George Wickham in Pride and Prejudice owes much to the fops of the day. Brighton was robbed of the presence of many of these characters when George IV abruptly abandoned his seaside creation in 1827. He never returned, and the reason for his departure was the Lady Conyngham of Jane's earlier letter. Diamond-cut graffiti about her, carved into one of the pavilion's window panes, caused her so much offence she refused to ever go back to Brighton again. Just as Bath had developed because of the reputed benefits to health of the spa waters, the new seaside town of Brighton had been advocating the health benefits of seawater since 1750. In one of her letters, Jane Austen mentions sea bathing, but in her case feels that spending too long in the water may have been detrimental.
The bathing was so delightful this morning, and Molly so pressing with me to enjoy myself, that I believe I stayed in rather too long, as since the middle of the day I have felt unreasonably tired. I shall be more careful another time.
Therefore, whether it be seawater or spa water, attempting to find cures for various ailments was evidently a developing trend for the society in which Jane Austen lived. Jane Austen visited Bath in 1799, when her brother Edward and his family were there to take the waters, in the hope of finding a cure for his gout. Jane writes this report of his progress for Cassandra.
He was better yesterday than he had been for 2 or 3 days before, about as well as he was at Steventon. He drinks from the Hetling pump, is to bathe tomorrow, and try electricity on Tuesday. He proposed the latter himself to Dr. Fellows, who made no objection to it, but I fancy we are all unanimous in expecting no advantage from it.
This letter from Jane Austen typifies the medical vagaries of the day. All treatments were rather hit and miss, with the majority of families relying upon their own traditional remedies and nursing skills. The Austen family would have had access to a professional medical man for serious illness, but his success would not have been guaranteed. When Jane became seriously ill, with what we now know to have been Addison's disease, Mr. Lyford, a surgeon of good repute, was engaged to treat her. Although he was obviously confident of curing her, Jane was realistically unconvinced.
Mr. Lyford says he will cure me, and if he fails I shall draw up a memorial and lay it before the Dean and Chapter, and have no doubt of redress from that pious, learned and disinterested body.
Mr. Lyford was a surgeon, and it is interesting to consider the growth in this particular profession. By 1800, Bath could claim 18 surgeons, and the wars with both America and France had also increased the numbers of surgeons needed to help injured soldiers and sailors. The prospect of surgery without anaesthetic, as it would have been in Jane Austen's day, would have been horrific. We have one very vivid account of what it was like in the diaries of novelist Fanny Burney. In 1811, while living in France, Fanny developed pain and swelling in her breast, which was probably due to breast cancer. Her will to live must have been very strong, as she chose to have a mastectomy performed in her own kitchen, and without anaesthetic, rather than die from the cancer. This is part of her description of the 20-minute operation.
The knife went in, cutting through veins, arteries, flesh, nerves. I began a scream that lasted unintermittently during the whole time of the incision, and I almost marvel that it rings not in my ears still. The instrument, describing a curve, cutting against the grain, if I may so say, while the flesh resisted in a manner so forcible as to oppose and tire the hand of the operator. Despite this obviously gruesome experience, Fanny Burney survived another 29 years, with medical science improving all the time. Many discoveries were being made, and in this letter Jane Austen comments upon the work of Edward Jenner, a country doctor from Gloucestershire. Mrs. Bramston talked a good deal of nonsense, which Mr. Bramston and Mr. Clark seemed almost equally to enjoy. There was a whist and casino table, and 6 outsiders. Rice and Lucy made love, and Matthew Robinson fell asleep. James and Mrs. Augusta alternately read Dr. Jenner's pamphlet on the cowpox, and I bestowed my company by turns on all. Jane Austen is without doubt making a light-hearted comment here, but the work of Dr. Jenner made a tremendous contribution to public health. This is the Chantry in Berkeley, home of the famous doctor and now the Jenner Museum. Jenner had suffered from smallpox as a child, and as a country doctor he was frustrated by the number of his patients, particularly the children, who died from this terrible disease. Matters had been made worse by an early 18th century practice from the Middle East which involved inoculating healthy people with the smallpox lymph. The patient would then have the disease in a mild form and become immune. The adoption of the practice in England was encouraged by Lady Wortley Montagu, a leading social figure, but there was a big problem. The percentage of fatalities was decreased, but the number of cases increased.